Hi, it's Andy, and this is our preview for this week's message. This week's message is on Romans 1:16 and 17, and these two verses are pretty commonly known, may not have them quotable by any stretch, but they're known. It begins with, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of salvation for those who believe." First for the Jew, and then for the Gentile. Then it goes on to talk about righteousness and faith. And there's a lot of debate, especially on verse 17, how we are to interpret the righteousness of God and from faith to faith. And even Paul's quotation of Habakkuk 2, that the righteous shall live by faith. And I'll get into that, some of that in next week's videos. I've done a lot of research, hours and hours of reading over this past week or so, trying to get to the heart of it. And I'll share my beliefs on Sunday. But today I want to focus just a little bit on what it means to be ashamed. And when Paul says this, it's not really a moral shame. Well, you should be ashamed of yourself, although there is some of that. In Corinthians, for instance, in 1 Corinthians, in his first letter, it says that people considered his message the foolishness of God. And Paul says, well, the foolishness of God is better than the best that man has to offer. In Rome, after Paul was, had died and gone on, and I don't know how many years this was, but there was a picture that was on plaster on a wall in Rome, and it showed a picture of a donkey hanging on the cross and a man kneeling at it. And it was talking about the absurdity, how asinine it was for someone to worship a dead guy, and because that's what the Romans believed. And so that mentality was pervasive in the day. It was very much a part of the culture that Paul knew, that Paul taught in, that Paul worshipped in, etc. And as he's going to Rome, it would have been very much a part, or as he's hoping to go to Rome, I should say, in writing to Rome, it's very much a part of the culture that those people would have had awareness regarding. And so this is what Paul is saying, "For I am not ashamed." Now, there's a lot of people believe that this is a literary device that he's using, "For I am not ashamed." It's called litides. And litides is, it's really the idea of like if we were to saying, well, you won't be sorry about this, we're really saying you should feel great about this, right? So it's just a way of speaking, a literary device. And so rather than Paul saying I am not ashamed, many scholars believe he's saying I am confident in the gospel of Christ. So again, it's not necessarily about a moral shaming, although there is some evidence of that. It's about a confidence that Paul has. And as I think about that, part of that confidence comes from Paul's confidence in his calling. And I don't necessarily mean Paul's calling to be a missionary and all of that, although that's a part of it. It's just a confidence in who he is. And, for so many of us, I think there is this idea of playing with our faith. And really, this is the heart of what Romans 1:16 and 17 is about, is that if the power of God, of the gospel, transforms us, and the righteousness of God, verse 17, becomes a part of who we are, then we will be transformed. We will change. We can't help but be transformed when God's righteousness comes upon us. And it had for Paul. And so, one question that we can ask ourselves is, do you do you do what you have to do? Or are you doing what you want to do? Now, rest assured, there are times that we have to do things that we don't want to do. But by and large, as a career, perhaps, but calling is far much more than a career. As just who you are in your life, are you doing things that, well, I just have to do this, and you never break free from that? Or are you doing what you want to do? For Paul, he was doing what he wanted to do, what he was called to do, what he was supposed to do. And therefore, rather than being ashamed at some job, he was a tent maker by trade, but rather than being ashamed of that or ashamed of presenting, he was confident in who he was. And that allowed him to go forth, even amidst the persecution, even amidst the challenges and the trials that would come upon his life. He had that confidence. So I am confident in the gospel is essentially what Paul was saying. I think a lot of us, we have what's called like shadow lives or shadow careers. We have shadow pursuits, even they're called, where what we really want to do is this, but we're not willing to take the risks. We're not really willing to put forth the effort for that. So we do something that is similar, but we don't put it all out there to fully engage in what we are called to engage. So as we think about Paul's words, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, or for I am confident in the gospel, as it might better be said, what are you confident in? How has God made you? What has God called you to do? This Sunday, I'm going to talk about the Christian life is not something that we audit. It is something that God has given us credit for already. We just have to claim it. But if we are confident in that, and if we are confident in the power of God, as it says in Romans 1:16, that comes from the gospel, that is presented in the gospel, the power of God that brings us salvation, then shouldn't we live with the power of God within us? So that'll be part of Sunday's message. We are planning on partaking of the Lord's Supper on Sunday as well. So I hope you can join us this Sunday. Next week, I'll talk more about these verses and some of the challenges of the interpretation in them in my daily videos, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of next week.